Hi, it's Hillary. The information in this slide presentation is designed to help you as you write your final section of a critical inquiry, where you evaluate the arguments and come to a final judgment. But first, a note, much of the information in this slide presentation is based on Reason in the Balance by Sharon Balin and Mark Battersby, especially chapters 9 and 10. Any errors, of course, in this slide presentation are my own and not theirs. Well, you've come to a point where you're ready to make a final judgment. You have many threads of information that you've collected and used, different websites, different primary resources like scientific peer-reviewed articles and studies, meta-analyses, or summary reviews. And you've added some filters. As you've looked at that information, you've asked yourself, is the argument logically sound? Is the evidence credible? And is the evidence even relevant to my initial question? Some of those filters that you've used have made you decide maybe not to use that thread of evidence or thread of argument. Or you've maybe had to modify. Maybe part of an argument makes sense, but another part of the argument doesn't make sense. But in any case, you've gathered arguments and you've gathered evidence, and you're ready to make your final judgment. And there it is, the big final judgment. To do a final judgment, it's admittedly not easy. You have to be part artist, part logician, doing logic. You have to be a great listener. And on top of all that, you have to be accurate, compassionate, non-biased, intellectually honest. You have to weigh different factors differently. You have to consider alternate options. It's quite a challenge. So let's see what evaluating and weighing the arguments and coming to a final judgment looks like with a specific example. The first thing you want to do is make a modified pros and cons table. This pro and cons table will show the arguments, but it will also show your evaluation of each argument based on the deep reading and study that you've done on the issue so far. So, for example, this table about capital punishment lists all the arguments in favor of capital punishment. The first argument, incapacitation, states that if a murderer is executed for his crime, he will not be able to commit any more murders. And the evaluation of that is, yes, that's true, but life imprisonment will accomplish the same thing, the same goal. The second argument is deterrence, which states that knowledge that capital punishment is a possibility will discourage people from committing heinous crimes or, for example, murders. Well, the inquirers that created this table found after deep study and discussion that the evidence does not really show that capital punishment deters murder. In fact, they cited one study that shows that murder is actually at a higher level in states that practice capital punishment compared to states that do not practice capital punishment. They also discussed the fact that many murders are committed against someone that the murderer knows, which would suggest that these murders are often a product of passion and that the murderer is not actually considering consequences such as the possibility of capital punishment. So the evidence does not really support this argument of deterrence. The third argument, called retribution, is one which speaks more to a view of justice, saying that if someone has committed a serious crime, they should receive a serious punishment. And the evaluation of that is, yes, again, that may be true, but life imprisonment is also a very serious punishment. The final argument, cost, states that capital punishment is cheaper to the government than life imprisonment. The evaluation to that argument is twofold. The first objection says that actually some evidence shows that life imprisonment is cheaper than capital punishment. And the second point in this evaluation is that cost is less important than morality. In other words, the fact that it's cheaper than life imprisonment does not outweigh some of the moral issues that will come up in the con side of this table. As we look at this table in more detail, we can see that the evaluations are based somewhat on the filters we've used to analyze and evaluate the arguments. For example, this first one is a question really of the logic or completeness of the argument. Yes, it is true that someone who is executed can't commit more murders. But this arguer has failed to acknowledge that there is another alternative, life imprisonment, which accomplishes the same goal. The second argument, deterrence, we have rejected somewhat because the evidence does not show that it's a true argument. The third, retribution, we have analyzed as well. Similar to the first one, the arguer created a false dilemma between severe punishment and no punishment by failing to acknowledge that life imprisonment is also a severe punishment. Number one in the evaluation of cost, again, is an evidence filter. The evidence doesn't really prove that capital punishment is cheaper than life imprisonment. And the final one is the relevance. Is cost of capital punishment more relevant, more weighty than the issue of morality? So evidence has definitely allowed us to not consider highly this deterrence argument, and evidence has allowed us to not consider strongly the cost argument. And then we have the morality argument, which also puts a big X over the cost argument. But there are some things we do want to pay attention to. We want to make sure, as we're developing our final judgment, that we do listen to the concerns of the pro side. And they are concerned about the level of murder or heinous crimes, for example, in our country, and they are concerned about a sense of justice. So as we're developing our final judgment, we want to make sure we do listen to the other side and what their concerns are, and how in our judgment can we accommodate these concerns, even if our final judgment is on the opposite side. Now let's look at the con side of capital punishment, the arguments against capital punishment. The first argument is morality, and it states that taking a life is morally wrong. Now obviously that is definitely a value judgment, a moral judgment. Of course, in past centuries, capital punishment was not viewed by the majority of people as wrong, and so things have been changing over the years, and there are countries that do allow capital punishment besides the United States. But the inquirers that created this table believe that taking a life is morally wrong is a basic foundational principle of our society, and therefore it will need strong reasons to override that argument. The second argument is rehabilitation. It states that if you commit or if you execute a murderer for his crime or her crime, you won't be able to rehabilitate that person. The inquiries on this issue concluded sort of a neutral on that one, because rehabilitation in prisons is not, there's not strong evidence for or against that it occurs or does not occur, and so they just decided to leave it as an unresolved issue. The third argument, executing the innocent, states that it is morally unacceptable to wrongly execute an innocent person. Now that is something that almost everybody will agree to. Taking a life is morally wrong. You may have people on both sides of it, but taking the life of an innocent person, I think almost everybody would agree to that. And they've found, the evidence shows, that the risk is significant of innocent people being executed. For example, since between 1973 and 2019, 166 people on death row have been exonerated. That's 3 or 4 a year who have been found innocent, or at least have found a reasonable doubt in the case. So that is a strong moral argument against capital punishment. The fourth reason, social causality, states that a difficult environment or upbringing may have led the criminals to commit murder, just social causes. And while that may be true, state the inquirers, it does not justify murder, but it does suggest a need for compassion when considering this issue. The final fifth argument, labeled discrimination, is that an alleged criminal is more likely to receive the death penalty if they are black or a minority, or if the victim is white. Again, the evidence comes down very strongly in supporting this argument. Virtually every study of death penalty cases has shown a pattern of discrimination, either when considering the alleged criminal or when considering the victim. Now, if we look at these arguments in the con side, the side against capital punishment, we see that three of them are really quite strong and somewhat based on ethics and morality. The taking of the life, the taking of an innocent life, which is also combined with strong evidence that the risk is significant, and the fact that discrimination or a pattern of discrimination occurs in death penalty cases, again with a strong supporting evidence to support this moral argument. So we can give some strong checks to those three arguments, and note that we need to learn more about the issue of rehabilitation. Let me talk for a second about burden of proof. Burden of proof essentially asks who has to make the strongest argument in this issue. And usually it's the people who are trying to make an argument against the status quo or against the prevailing opinion. So, for example, in capital punishment, the status quo is that it is permitted in some states in the United States. So apparently society has accepted it. So the burden of proof is on those who would argue against the status quo, against capital punishment. And they have to make a strong argument that capital punishment is the wrong choice. On the other hand, some would argue that the prevailing international opinion about capital punishment is against capital punishment. In that case, those people who want to maintain the practice of capital punishment have the burden of proof to show that the international opinion, prevailing international opinion, is incorrect. So in the case of the issue of capital punishment, the idea of burden of proof could go either way depending on how you look at it. Very often, though, the burden of proof is clearly on one side or the other, on one argument or the other. Often your inquiries will involve answering a combination of factual, ethical, and instrumental questions. And I'd like to take a quick look at the criteria for answering what could be the most difficult of these questions, the ethical questions. And I like this list of 3 things to consider when you're considering an ethical question. You want to ask about the moral quality of the act. For example, in capital punishment, one of the arguments was it's just morally wrong to kill a person. You also want to ask about the duties and responsibilities of the actor. And again, in the capital punishment issue, one of the duties and responsibilities of the government is to keep our society safe. We have to take that into account when we're considering the question of capital punishment. But another duty and responsibility may be to encourage a forward-looking and compassionate society. So we also have to consider that. Finally, the third one, the consequences of the act. In capital punishment, what are some of the consequences of capital punishment? Well, one of them that the inquirers felt was particularly important was the possibility of executing innocent individuals. So I really like this list of 3 ways. Ethics is very complicated, very difficult sometimes to tease out everything that's going on, and this little list of 3 is very helpful when you're making your own final judgment for your inquiry. So where are we? We have collected all the arguments, we've evaluated the arguments in our tables, we've established burden of proof if there needs to be established a burden of proof, we've looked at alternatives, we've looked at the strengths in different viewpoints, we've considered our own personal bias, and now it's time to weigh and balance the different considerations. And like I said before, it's not easy. There's no magic formula. So we just have to take it step by step. Of course, strong evidence should outweigh weak evidence, but when you get to some of these other balances, well, this is where all your research and thought and discussion come to the fore. For example, does the cost of social distancing outweigh the benefit of reducing the curve? Or does reducing the curve of cases of COVID-19 outweigh the cost of social distancing? Or the means? There's different ways to lower the curve. Is social distancing the best way, or is legally imposed or law enforcement imposed quarantine the best way? And when you're discussing means, you also have to think about ends and means. Does the end justify the means or not? We've talked about how ethical considerations should probably weigh more in your final judgment than practical considerations. And then we get to values. Not all values are heavy moral values. They could be more practical values, such as, does environmental protection outweigh economic progress in a certain issue, or the other way around? Does spending issues, you have to always make value decisions. Is it better to spend money on our space program or on elementary education? Or are those two things not mutually exclusive at all? And then, of course, the moral issues are similar to the value issues, but have much stronger emotional impact as well. These issues would be gun control, abortion, capital punishment. All those issues have a strong moral component in them. But eventually, some arguments will outweigh other arguments for you, and you'll come to a final judgment. Then you have to decide for yourself, how confident are you of your judgment? And let your reader know you're very confident about this judgment because the weight of the reasons clearly support the judgment. You're reasonably confident about the judgment because the weight of the reasons do strongly support it, but there's still some fairly strong countervailing arguments. A tentative judgment. The weight of the reasons is not overwhelming, but has you leaning towards that side. Or a suspended judgment. Either the weight of the reasons are very closely balanced, or there's just not enough evidence to make a decision. So it's time to write your final judgment. You'll lay out the issue one more time, give your strong arguments that support your position, point out any weaknesses in your own arguments. Honesty is always the best policy when you're trying to make a strong argument. Point up at least one of the stronger opposing arguments and point out your response to it. Give space for the alternative perspectives. Discuss some of those alternative perspectives. Let the reader know how confident you are of your judgment. And finally conclude with a concluding few sentences that summarize what you've learned and give your reader something to do, a plan of action, something to think about. In other words, you started with a great hook, this paper, end with a bang. Give your reader something to really move on. So we're done, right? We've collected all our information, we've analyzed it, we've weighed it, we've evaluated it, we've come to a final judgment, we've written our paper. But of course, we're leaving off the most important last question of guided inquiry. What do I do with this information now that I have it? What do I do to make the world a better place? However you act on your final judgment, it may be something small, like sharing your paper with a classmate or starting a conversation. It may be deciding to buy something or not buy something, to vote for a particular candidate, to join a certain organization, to pursue further research. Whatever it is, it's very, very important. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and found it helpful, and it will help you as you write the final sections and paragraphs of your critical inquiry. Take care.